My deadbeat husband came to my office party and asked the CEO's wife if she could loan him money for his investment opportunity, but he didn't know already planned about his future. We'd been married 7 years, and Vincent hadn't worked for the last 5. Lost his warehouse supervisor job for chronic lateness. Said he needed time to explore entrepreneurship. I believed him, supported him completely while he supposedly researched business ideas. 5 years later, he'd started exactly 0 businesses. Spent his days gaming online, ordering expensive gaming equipment on my credit cards. Asked for fun money every week like I was his personal ATM. $500 here for a new headset, $300 there for concert tickets with his buddies, $800 for a weekend trip to Vegas with his brother. When I suggested he get even a part-time job while building his business plan, he'd sulk for days, saying I didn't believe in his vision. The holiday party was the breaking point. He showed up in a wrinkled polo shirt, immediately headed for the premium open bar, and started working the room like a used car salesman. Pitched his latest scheme to everyone, some ridiculous cryptocurrency day trading platform he discovered on YouTube. The CEO's wife, Mrs. Brennan, was his prime target. Followed her around all evening, explaining how he just needed startup capital to turn $5,000 into $50,000. She kept trying to politely escape, but Vincent wouldn't take the hint. Even grabbed her phone to input his Venmo handle for when she was ready to invest. 3 days after the party, everything shifted. My manager, Elaine, called me in for an urgent meeting. Said she'd received multiple complaints about the holiday party, specifically about my husband's aggressive solicitation of colleagues and their spouses. Mrs. Brennan had formally complained to HR about feeling harassed and cornered. 2 other executives' spouses reported similar uncomfortable encounters. Elaine said while she understood I couldn't control another adult's behavior, the company had concerns about my judgment in bringing someone who would use a professional event as his personal fundraising opportunity. They decided to restructure my department. I was being moved to a lateral position with no direct reports, essentially a demotion without the title change. My rival colleague Janet would be taking over my team and the high-visibility projects I'd spent 3 years developing. The salary stayed the same, but the year-end bonus structure changed, cutting my total compensation by roughly 30%. I asked if there was any way to reverse this decision. Elaine said the leadership team had lost confidence in my professional judgment. I went home furious, but Vincent was already gone, out at his brother Tony's place. When he came back at midnight reeking of beer, I confronted him about the party. He shrugged, said I was overreacting, that Mrs. Brennan was probably interested but too uptight to admit it in front of other people. When I explained his behavior cost me my position and 30% of our income, he actually got angry at me. Said if I'd been more supportive of his networking efforts instead of always being negative, maybe he'd have succeeded by now. Then he had the audacity to ask for $400 because he'd promised Tony they'd go to a playoff game that weekend. That's when something inside me snapped completely. The next morning, while Vincent slept until noon as usual, I took decisive action. Opened a new bank account at a different bank, redirected my direct deposit, canceled all the credit cards he had access to, called my divorce attorney friend Rebecca for a consultation that afternoon. She reviewed our finances and nearly laughed out loud. Vincent had no income, no assets, no property in his name. The house was my premarital property. All our joint assets came from my earnings. In our state, spousal support required the requesting spouse to demonstrate effort towards self-sufficiency. 5 years of documented unemployment while refusing work would destroy any alimony claim. Rebecca said he'd get essentially nothing except his personal belongings. When Vincent finally woke up at 2 in the afternoon, his cards were already declined at the coffee shop. He came home raging about the technical glitch with our accounts. That's when I handed him the separation papers Rebecca had rush prepared. Told him he had 2 weeks to move out. His face went from confusion to rage to panic in seconds. Started screaming about how I couldn't just abandon him, how he'd given me the best years of his life, how his big break was right around the corner. I reminded him those were my best years he'd wasted, my money he'd burned through, my career he'd just destroyed. He tried to argue that he'd sue for half of everything, that he'd been a house husband supporting my career. I pulled out the printed bank statements showing thousands in gaming purchases, concert tickets, and boys' trips. No groceries, no household expenses, nothing that suggested domestic contribution. He stood there speechless, then quietly asked where he was supposed to go with no money. I suggested he try Tony's couch and figure out that entrepreneurship plan he'd been working on for 5 years. He left that night with 2 suitcases and hasn't been back.